candidate who will do away with daylight savings time, and I'll vote for him regardless of the other issues. Might be the only unifying thing that the entire country can agree on.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
All right, well, so for those who are joining us today, welcome. Thank you for being with us. This is Voices in the Wilderness. We're a show where we talk about kind of tough issues, especially on science and faith. Issues that have been a stumbling block for many in the church and a barrier for people to come to Christ. And we hope to present different voices to help think about these issues and talk about them and some of the nuances that are involved in these conversations. So we're really glad that you're joining us. And there are ways that you can ask questions either through Facebook or YouTube in the comment section. And if we have time, we'll try to get to some of those questions. And I'm going to go ahead now and introduce our guest today is Dr. Walter A. Rogero II, who holds a doctorate of ministry, a master's of divinity, and a master's in missions, all from Oral Roberts University, with his doctoral work focusing on creating religion and science dialogue in local congregations. He's currently a hospice chaplain, a consultant, and the founder of Framing Conversations, an organization that seeks to help individuals, churches, and groups navigate the big questions related to science, philosophy, and historic Christian faith. Prior to this, Walter was a senior program associate for the Phase 1 of the Science for Seminaries Project of the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, Dialogue on Science, Ethic, and Religion in Washington, D.C., and a project advisor for the Phase 2 of this project. He has served pastoral roles for more than 25 years in several denominational settings. In addition to serving churches in Oklahoma and Florida, he was the senior pastor of churches in Arlington, Virginia, and Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts, and in Mountain Home, Arkansas, where he currently resides. Thank you so much for joining us today, Walter. So, how are you doing? How's the weather there? I'm guessing it's probably a little bit warmer than it is here in Minnesota.
Well, I almost don't want to say, Christine, because I know that's a little different. I just had a walk. It's 60 degrees, sunny, with a beautiful little breeze outside. It's just a gorgeous day.
Beautiful. Well, I woke up yesterday morning and it was 8 below. But today it's pretty nice. It's already up to 40. So we're really looking forward to a little bit of warmer weather coming up. So, and
well, 40 is getting there, isn't it?
I know. I think we have a couple days of 50s in the forecast for this week. So looking forward to some walks myself. So tell us a little bit about your background, both like academic and spiritual, so our guests know who you are.
Well, I could take the whole hour talking about that, and I'll try to give the elevator speech version. I grew up Roman Catholic and went to a Southern Baptist university for my undergraduate studies, where I studied music education. They were embroiled in the controversy 80s, the conservative elements and the more progressive liberal elements in the church. And because it was a Baptist university, there was a required class in our Judeo-Christian heritage, but because of the ongoing struggle, it was really a primer in classical liberal theology. And after I finished that class, I really didn't believe anything. And it didn't help any that the leader of the Baptist Student Union was taking showers with his girlfriend in our suite bath. And so I came to believe that Christians were either hypocrites or they were idiots. And that was my experience early in college. That was my freshman year. Later, I fell in with a professor and began working with him in an entrepreneurial venture. And through that relationship, got saved in an extremely fundamental, extremely conservative Bible study group, and was very demonstrative. A lot of folks from other nations in that group, and so I saw deliverance ministry, I saw praying in tongues, a lot of the things that charismatics are known for, and yet it was very normalized, and that was the way of life in this group. As a matter of fact, I so radically changed my view of the world that I got rid of a lot of materials, a lot of media. I kept my Lewis, my C.S. Lewis, but I burned my Tolkien books because, of course, there are wizards and things like that in those. And spent several years in a church that was associated with the Assemblies of God in Florida, where I grew up, but on the extreme charismatic fringe. A lot of Charisma magazine staff attended the church. And so I was as charismatic as you could get, as Pentecost could get, and yet my worldview was extremely, extremely narrow. And during that time, I felt called into ministry. And so I went to Oral Roberts University, where I felt that I could go to school without losing my faith. And actually, prior to that, I went into a bookstore one day. Now, growing up, I wanted to be a paleontologist, an anthropologist, or an archaeologist. That was my goal growing up. And prior to going into music education, I had a 4-year ride with the Air Force in meteorology, which just a couple weeks before the end of school, I was declared unfit for military service. I had flat feet and bunions. And so then it was like, what on earth am I going to do? Am I going to end up in the community college in my hometown, or am I going to end up somewhere else? And what ended up happening was there was an intern and they needed flute players, which I'm a flute player in this college. And so there you go. I was what wanted me, and got through this thing and out, was working in this entrepreneurial venture and felt called into ministry. And so off I went in ministry to Oral Roberts University. Prior to going to Oral Roberts, though, I ended up as a youth pastor or youth director in a United Methodist church. Now, there's a long story about that, and I was surprised to end up in a United Methodist church, but there I was, and off I went from there to seminary. I felt that my world got a little larger, and in that time period before I went to seminary, of course, the Christian bookstore, which there were Christian bookstores at that time, was the repository of all knowledge, if you will. And I remember one day I went into a Christian bookstore and I found Henry Morris's works on young Earth creationism, and overnight the world changed. And I thought, well, you know, if I can believe in deliverance ministry and I can talk in tongues, and my worldview is already so shifted, then why can't I believe that the world was created in 6 literal days, 6,000 years ago? And so overnight, literally, my whole view of the world changed at that point. So off I went to Oral Roberts University. And at Oral Roberts University, what I discovered was a faculty that was united in their experience of glossolalia, speaking in tongues, but they came from every denomination, every theological stripe. I was in classes one day with a Presbyterian professor, and then the next day in an Arminian classroom, one day in a room with a Methodist, the next day in a room with a Catholic, leading those classes that I took. So during that process, I began getting a much broader view of the Christian world. And another thing that happened to me there was I met an engineer named Dominic Halsmer in an apologetics class. He was a guest lecturer. Some of the listeners may know him. And he introduced me to the works of Hugh Ross. And after reading Hugh Ross's works, well, I got an older view of the universe. I thought, okay, well, this is another way that I could look at the universe. And then when I got out of school, I was working in a Methodist church, First Assemblies of God churches, then a Methodist church, and then found myself into the Assemblies of God again, and really wanted to go on and do a PhD. But I had a young family, I was involved in ministry, I wanted to grow in what I was doing, and so what I thought I'd do is a doctorate as a stepping stone to a PhD, as a kind of academic placeholder to keep myself viable. And when I started that work, I started it in the town I was in, and wanted to really address issues of how it was that we came to believe what we came to believe. I wanted to look at the role of fantasy in faith development. And after changing churches and some other things, needed to modify that. And so I went back to my age-old interest in science and said, well, I want to create the ability to talk about scientific matters inside the local congregation. And so I began a project to create a seminar for the local church as my DMin project. And after about 3 years of research, I began to realize that I didn't even know what I didn't know. Again, I wanted to use this research to move PhD status, move on to do a PhD. And I realized that all I was going to do if I did my seminar at that point was to prove that I didn't even know what I was talking about. And so I circled back around and then back around and then back around and moved and had more children and you name it. And before I knew it, about 15 years had passed. And I finally did eventually get that doctorate of ministry. And most of the work that I had done, even though it was being guided by professors, they weren't professors in this field. And so I wasn't at all certain that I even knew what I was talking about. But in that journey, I did present at a denominational conference, and I met Jennifer Wiseman, who was working at the American Association for the Advancement of Science at the time, and found myself invited to a panel discussion. And here I was, a local pastor. I was pastoring in the area, and the only thing that I can imagine that got me invited there was I was somebody who was interested in the topic, and I was local. And I got there and found out that I was there with NASA scientists and deans of seminaries, and I just thought, good grief, I've been dropped in the deep end, and I have no idea what I'm going to do here. As a matter of fact, I'm probably better just kind of hush and just listen. And what ended up happening was I found that the research that I had done, I could actually talk with people, and even made some contribution to that panel discussion. And that ultimately led to a program at the AAAS called Science for Seminaries. And Science for Seminaries paired working scientists with seminary professors from schools across the theological spectrum and created dialogue between them so that the core classes that these professors were teaching were altered in some way, and the future pastors, future ministers would be touched in some way by the world of science in the way that the scientific consensus talks about the world of science. And I say that I just kept staring in the windows at the AAAS until they finally hired me, and I found myself working in that project itself. And I really still am not sure how I ended up there. A person with not a scientific degree in my background. I was working at the AAAS, and like many things in my life, I can only attribute that to the work of God. And so that's a brief thumbnail of my education and spiritual journey.
I'm curious, just from what you've laid out just there, you've traveled through a few different churches, and you've brought your journey has from accepting the faith, from becoming a believer. You went through the Henry Morris and into the Hugh Ross stage. And I joke sometimes with our viewers that I fell down the stairs, the creationist stairs, and I hit my head on every rung. So I've been everything: young Earth and gap theory and old Earth and intelligent design and everything. So but I'm just curious, for you, going through all that, was it a difficult transition from Henry Morris to Hugh Ross? Did it ever affect your faith either in the Bible or at whole? There's a vast difference between those two steps. Can you walk us through that a little bit, Walter?
I can. I would say that the entire process has been painful in a lot of ways. Uh, Growing up, I had no issues between faith and science whatsoever. I just didn't see that there was an issue. When I went through that time that I became a young Earth creationist, uh, it made perfect sense with the world that I inhabited in my biblical, historical views. And as I was in seminary and those views were being challenged and pressed on and expanded, Hugh Ross's views were very helpful. And then as I began doing my doctoral research, again, not having a theological paradigm that I needed to, I read everybody. And so I read process theologians, I read very conservative theologians, I read scientists, I read just everybody. And especially at first, I didn't have any framework to put these different people into. And so I would be reading one and just entering their world and trying to understand what they were saying and feeling very challenged, and then reading another one and entering their world and then feeling very challenged. It has been a very difficult and challenging journey. To wind back, though, one thing that has held me through this, two things out of my childhood. Before I went to kindergarten, believe it or not, I remember I was outside and I was thinking, my 4-year-old self, you're very old now and you better figure out what you're going to do with your life. And I thought, I want to be a paleontologist. Paleontologists in my 4-year-old thought knows what's really real and truly true. And that's been my guiding thread through all of this desire to really know what's real, what's true. Where can I put my flag and say, I can really stand on this. And another event that I had as a child that marked me deeply was a dream I had one time. And in that dream, I met Jesus Christ. And I don't know what Jesus looked like except from the knees down, because I remember we were sitting and I was looking down and he was wearing blue jeans and boots. And you have to understand, I grew up in a very rural area. I grew up hunting and fishing, and that was kind of my whole world. And it wasn't so much what I saw or what was said, because I don't remember anything that was said in it, so much as the sense of light and peace that I had in that. And those things that happen to us through our lives mark us, and we need to make sense out of them in some way as we walk through life. And so it is very jarring and painful. As a matter of fact, I think my mother is somewhere in the mix in cyberspace right now listening. And after I came to Christ in college, I had a very uncharitable conversation with my mother when I said to her, "Mom, I'm never going to church with you again." And how terrible that was, and how painful that was, I'm sure, for her and for me too. But it was me saying, I'm committed, I'm going forward, I want to know what's real, I want to know what's true, and I want to embrace it. And that was really the thread that's led me through all of this, and the thread that continues to lead me today. And I feel that I have taken a lot of interesting turns and windings that I would like to help others process without having to process it with their life. If they can process it mentally and think through and avoid some things that are difficult emotionally, I would like to do that.
Hit their head on less steps on the way there through their journey.
Hit their head on less steps on the way down, but we have to be careful because even saying something like that frames the conversation in such a way that there are people who will not want to listen to it. And so there is a pain there, there is a hurt. And I've even heard it said, you can always tell what church hurt an atheist by the way that they engage the faith. Mm-hmm. And so there's a pastoral and a human sympathy that we can miss if we simply start characterizing people into these slots and then say of that person, well, this is who you are. And
Mm.
that's a great deal of what I've attempted to do is say, well, these slots are really ultimately not helpful if we want dialogue, if we want to talk back and forth, if we want to humanize somebody. They're intrinsically dehumanizing to talk about young Earth creationism, old Earth creationism, gap, or whatever. When we slot someone in that, we really miss something very powerful. When I went to, so about 8 years into my doctoral research, my boss told me, Walter, you've been researching forever. The denomination, the Assemblies of God, are having their first conference on faith and science. Why don't you do something useful? Why don't you go to this thing and make some kind of presentation? And so I did a breakout session, and I pitched a lot of different things, and they bought on one of them and they were so kind to let me come and speak in a breakout session. But then I realized I don't know how to get my hands around this faith and science thing. I don't know how to talk about it. I don't know how to figure it out. And the thought that I had, it's almost like trying to pick up a beach ball with one hand. You just can't quite get your hands around it or understand it. And so for that conference, I developed a model to look at the epistemological underpinnings of a person's viewpoints in these matters. Use the Wesleyan Quadrilateral if you're familiar with that, and I won't go into detail with it. But later, I was at another conference where Hugh Ross was a keynote speaker. And I had used not Hugh Ross himself, but his book, what was it? One of his books, something in the cosmos. I've lost it right now. And I took the viewpoint that was in that book and I broke it down into the component parts of what it says about the Bible, what it says about the ability of human reason to know something, what it says about human experience, and what it says about the traditions of the church and otherwise. And so we had this model that if there was a homogeneous line that said this is old Earth creationism, that viewpoint was these categories, young Earth in one place, another. Now, that probably doesn't do a really good job of describing it, but what I'm saying is Hugh Ross is very easy to pigeonhole as, quote, an old Earth creationist. And yet, when I took this model, really there were aspects, particularly his aspect of viewing the Bible, that was very, very Bible centristic, almost a fundamentalist view of the Bible. But his view of human reason was extremely high. He's an astrophysicist and brilliant intellectually, which gave a more orbed picture of who he was. Well, some joker at this conference where he's keynoting, and I was presenting this model again, sat him down at the table with me and said, "Hey, Hugh, this guy says this about you." And Hugh Ross didn't actually go point, but there was another one of his staff there, and he ended by saying, "Hey, Hugh, that's you, that's you." And so, you know, I'm not saying that there's any endorsement there, but my effort from the beginning has been to remember the humanity of the other in these discussions and prioritize that highest so that we can enter into a dialogue and not simply trip worldview defenses, not simply turn it into a battle of fact versus fact. Instead, try to create a relationship where we say, here's how to understand me, and here's how to understand you, and how can we understand how we view the world in similar and different ways, and why.
So let me jump in real quick and just let us know that, as Christine said, we are available for comment on Facebook and YouTube. Facebook comment from, oh, I'm sorry, that's the wrong one. This is just come in from Ken Hogemuth, who says hello from Tulsa. home of ORU and Dominic Halsmer. Hello, Ken. The book, I think, the title of the book you were looking for was "The Creator and the Cosmos" by Hugh Ross. And while you have a very congenial demeanor towards these conversations, Doctor, it reminds me kind of the book "The Fool and the Heretic," where an evolutionary creationist sits down and talks to a young Earth creationist who at least observes that evolution isn't a theory in crisis, and they have a conversation. But if you read the book, it's a very difficult one. I mean, there was even trepidation over whether to break bread together, which seems from the outside, and we have many people who watch our show who aren't under the Big Tent. I mean, we have ex-evangelicals who, because of this conversation, have left the faith and might consider themselves nuns or of no religious affiliation. We also have former evangelicals who consider themselves atheists now. So I think it's admirable that you don't want to consider the steps or what have you. But the divisions seem to persist, at least in the conversations online and so forth, and the back and forth. So let me ask you in this way. Is it really not about young Earth creationism or old Earth creationism or even intelligent design versus those who accept modern science? Is it more our reading of the Word of God? Is it more the idea of we take the Word of God to be concordist or to basically be historical and also inerrant in things of history and science, and those who take a different reading on the Word of God? So the two books that Francis Bacon postulated, God's Word and God's World, don't necessarily have to be twisted to make sense of each other. Maybe you could comment on that idea of, is it really about creationism, and does it relate really underneath to not how we look at science, but how we look at the Bible?
Well, I think there's a false dichotomy inherent in that question. There is, and there are a lot of false dichotomies in these questions. It's not about how we look at science or how we look at the Bible. It's about how we look at science and how we look at the Bible. It's both. Sometimes I would say that sometimes we buy the science over faith view, and sometimes we buy the faith over science view. But I really like Lawrence Principe's view that there's something very complex happening here. I mean, we can break things down into Ian Barber's 4 categories, faith versus science, science versus, or faith over science, science over faith, something that creates a concordance between the two, or something where they're just non-overlapping magisteria, to use Gould's words. But I really think that the whole thing's not quite that clear-cut, especially when you get into somebody's head. Now, some individuals, yes, it's very, very clear-cut. And yet, really for a lot, they're dealing with a mishmash of a lot of things. They were enculturated in certain ways, and then in later times, they received other enculturating data. I mean, scientists go through a process of an apprenticeship that is every bit as imprinting as a child growing up in the tutelage of a church. And so, again, we like to we want so much to know this is my spot. This is where I land. And yet, even in that, there's oftentimes a lot of conflicting underneath talk. A lot of it happening between the conscious and the subconscious. The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Again, many people probably read. And realizing that I was reading the end passage of that book, how much he's recast the meeting of the disciples with Jesus on the Sea of Galilee, where he cooks fish, and there's some ending things. And so much of C.S. Lewis's writings snuck under my radar when I was very little, and this is why I wanted to talk about the role of fantasy in faith development, that so many of those things have bubbled back up in my consciousness as I've walked this path of faith. And so I think that there's something very complex going on. When I did the seminar in the local church, it was a joke, but it's only a little bit joking when I said all we have to do in covering these matters is look at the history of science, philosophy, and theology from the time of Plato to the modern age. I mean, that's all we have to do in a one-day seminar, right? And so there are
We're breaking up a little bit.
some philosophical truth, or as a scientific truth, or as a religious truth. And frankly, when I began really considering this, you also have the truth of history, which lies behind some of those. You have the truth of literature, the truth of music, the truth of these other areas. And so many people today, especially in the scientific realm, looking for grant funding, are saying, well, we want to do research on what it is to be human. Well, people have been doing research on what it is to be human since there was a human on the planet. Read the Epic of Gilgamesh. It is a mess on what it is to be human and the question of that. And whether somebody on the street says, I am a theologian or a scientist or engaged in these big questions, most people would say, well, that's way over my head. And frankly, I think it's way over my head. And it's only a gift of God that has allowed me to hang around really smart people and listen a lot. But even though they might say that, every person you meet is wrestling with this question of what it means to be human. As a hospice pastor, I visit with people who were in Vietnam, or I visit with people who were in Korea, and most people don't know how horrific Korea was because Vietnam colored that. And they are wrestling with the question, what does it mean to be human after having participated in or seen the things I've seen? And what does it mean to relate to faith and science? And so these questions are at the essence, the core of who we are. We're built to ask them somehow. And I think engaging around that and finding ways of moving out is the answer to a lot of the questions. We try to get to the answer without walking with someone. At the AAAS, there was a remarkable project called the Perceptions Project, and it brought scientists and religious professionals of various kinds together, and it brought them together sometimes around a neutral area, a liminal area, if I could call it that. And so they would say, let's all meet at the planetarium. Let's all meet down at the aquarium. Let's all go to a museum together. And these groups of people that oftentimes were very distrustful of the other, as they began talking about, wow, look at that fish, that's amazing, or isn't that something what the stars look like? And then they began talking, all of a sudden they weren't a conservative theologian or a atheist professor of astrology or astronomy, pardon me. They were human beings just saying, wow, look at this. And they began talking, and they realized there were these commonalities, these things that they could dialogue about, because they were asking the same questions, but they were starting at different places. They had different experiences, and they had different reasons for weighting some of those experiences higher than others. And until we're willing to enter into dialogue with people, walk through very uncomfortable places sometimes with them, I feel that we have missed the mark in what Christ is calling us to do. We don't always have to win a conversation. Sometimes it's enough to walk with someone. I have a wonderful, wonderful friend who was in a horrible motorcycle accident. He was told he would never walk again. He would be lucky to live, come out of the hospital. 2 weeks later, after intensive prayer, the man got up out of that bed, walked out of the hospital, and is one of the most committed, loving believers that I've ever met in my life. But he is convinced that because he trusts God in the way that he trusts God, he has to read the Bible in a very literal way, and because the things that we have discovered through challenge some of that cosmology, some of that cosmogony, the way that we look at the universe and it was created, he says that he absolutely cannot believe that the moon landings were not staged on Earth. He cannot believe that we went to the moon because it would challenge centrally this deep and true faith that he has. And sometimes he broadcasts things that I just want to talk about. And I want to say, let's do something different because I don't agree with him. And yet, what good is that? He's a brother. He's someone I genuinely care about, and I may or may not be able to help him. But we can come to a place where our views of the Bible and our views of science are so intimately intertwined that overturning one over the other. And that is the painful piece. That is the piece that is unnecessary and deeply, deeply hurtful because it creates an enormous.
So I want to piggyback off of that because, for him, he's committed to Christ, and maybe for him personally, it's okay for him to be in that place. But he's going to be interacting with other people. And I was talking with a friend this weekend, and she has 2 kids that see Christians kind of in that light as maybe anti-vax or anti-science or having, kind of really fringe views about the universe around us. And they have dichotomized this, that Christians are anti-science and scientists are anti-theists, and wonder, how can you even believe in a God if it means you have to, reject all that we know about the world around us. So they kind of have this view, this like a scientism view, like everything that we know, we can know through science. How do you talk about that with someone when that's their starting place? Like they don't know that they can believe in God because they can't find him in a microscope or a telescope.
Well, I think it's a poor fit between the sort of friend that I was talking about and other people that I know in that question. And I think when you come to somebody who has adopted a reductionistic view of the world, whether they insist that the only lens that can be looked through is science, or the only lens that can be looked through is a lens of reading the Bible in a very literal way, and really packing a lot of modernist thought into that. And I won't go down that rabbit trail, but I think that anytime you have someone who is adopting a reductionist viewpoint, a viewpoint that limits other ways of looking at things, that you have a very difficult conversation point. And so that, again, was a reason that I tried to create a way of looking at the epistemological, the ways of knowing, the underpinnings of people's worldview. Because if we can find commonality, and this is me thinking missiologically, then we can build a bridge with that commonality. And so that commonality may be around our children. That commonality may be around something else. I'm going to pull it out of the world of this organization versus that organization and this influence group versus that one. I'm going to talk about a really grassroots thing. When we're talking from one person to the other person, then we are working to build whatever bridge we can build with that person to talk to them. And many times, the best bridge we can build is closing our mouth and listening to them and finding out where they're at, finding out what we can agree with that's in that worldview, and then adding to that something that may challenge it, and not saying I believe the same thing as you, not doing that at all, but saying, well, we agree this part, but here's why I'm at this over here, or have you considered this thought? Because really, someone who is caught in a reductionist view of the world is, you're not going to give them facts that are going to reason them beyond where they're at. You need to work with them and draw them along, and then employ the other tools of the faith, prayer, and you know, the belief that the Lord is going to work in their heart and their life. And that's the grassroots. I'm not talking about organizations, and certainly some people are very influential. But I think there is something beautiful in The Fool and the Heretic, which I have read. A fantastic book, because it prizes the relationship as primary. And when I first moved to Washington, D.C., when I pastored in Arlington, I was there with another minister in my conservative denomination. And we walked into the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. And I said, hey, look, there's the Hall of Human Origins. Let's go in there. And they looked at me and they said, I will not ever go in there. How can we have the conversation if we're not willing to go in there? And if they're not willing, whoever they are, to go in the world that we inhabit, will we go into the world that they inhabit and dwell with them to be a voice with them?
I want to let Dr. Clark Van Gilder have his say. He says personal epistemology has a ton to say about the way we frame our conversations on anything, especially faith and theology. There are rational, empirical, and metaphorical dimensions of personal epistemology, just to mention a few, that frame and constrain our conceptual and interpretive frameworks. In my opinion, this explains much of why it's so easy to dehumanize one another by various doctrinary labels when defending something perceived to be inerrant and infallible, etc. Thanks for watching, Dr. Van Gilder, which kind of leads me to this question, a little bit more pointed, possibly, Walter. You seem to be discussing on a one-to-one level almost. You know, if you're having dinner with somebody, or if you're in a relationship with somebody, how to have these discussions. And I think that's important on that micro level to understand the tactics that you're bringing up in this subject. And of course, we've talked about the fool and the heretic. But in the macro view of this whole thing,
so
you've
John,
mentioned.
I don't know what just happened. I don't know what just happened, but I lost the last 15 seconds.
Okay. What I want to say is you've been talking about one-on-one conversation with people, and this whole conversation is kind of revolving around the faith science topic, how they relate, and how we can actually talk about these things with less heat and more light, they might say. But I want to ask you a bigger question, a larger question, in the macro view of this whole thing. You've mentioned on a number of occasions that the fantasy world and that realm of mystery as it relates to faith, seems to be left on the back burner, at least since the in the wake of the Enlightenment. You mentioned C.S. Lewis a couple times, and I'll come back to Tolkien, your comments on Tolkien, but Lewis might be the last great apologist of the Christian religion, and many would say it's because he took that mystery view. It's because he tried to speak beyond the watchful dragons by slipping in Christian concepts in romantic literature. So my question to you is, when you survey Christian apologetics, modern apologetics, when you survey all those institutions, whether it's RTB or Discovery Institute or AIG, if we want to leave labels behind, I group them all together with most of modern apologetics, and they seem to be answering to the Enlightenment and not answering to that yearning that Pascal, that Augustine, that Lewis talked about, that sense of joy or yearning within every soul to know more about the mystery. Madeleine L'Engle talked about this. So can you comment, in a world of Enlightenment thinking, how do we get back to that worldview that might be considered superstitious or pre-modern?
Well, there were so many things that came to mind. C.S. Lewis did a lot more than just delve into the mystery. His last book, The Discarded Image, is an apology for returning to the medieval view, the pre-Enlightenment view, and mining its riches for the modern world. But he didn't live in that world. He lived in the world of high modernism, in the world of philosophical engagement when Wittgenstein and others were really in their heyday. He's replying and responding to a lot of the dialogue of the day. And I believe that Christians not only need to embrace the mystical, and really, when we talk about fantasy, fantasy is a word that I use in very technical terms. It's the twilight between our conscious and unconscious minds. And so raising the archetypes like Tolkien does to a visible level, to talk about them, to frame them, does something wonderful. And so C.S. Lewis was a powerful apologist, but he was an apologist who didn't retreat to engage the Enlightenment, as you're suggesting. He engaged the modern world, but he engaged it with pre-Enlightenment thought or a pre-Enlightenment perspective. And so there was something very complex and unique that he did in his person that is personally very affecting and involving for me. But as we look at the topic and the project of apologetics, apologetics has always been about arguing the faith. And it's been done a lot of different ways. And I do believe we are mired in a view that is taking on the Enlightenment. We need to move into, I think, instead of an apologetic move, I think we need to take a missionary move. My background is suggesting, and my whole education, that's the direction I'm going. And if I talk a lot about the individual, well, if an individual like a Francis Collins, who has a strong platform, approaches the scientific community as he has, he then becomes influential in very large ways. If we talk about, well, how could we maybe even address a denomination? Well, you need to understand how the denomination's power structures work. Is the power structure of the denomination coming out of its scholasticism, out of its school system, the universities it runs? Is it coming out of the leadership at the top? Is it a bishopric that is very episcopal with a downward focus, or is it a grassroots up, like the Disciples of Christ, where each individual congregation literally can set its own theological viewpoints, or what combination, or where do these lie? There's not a one-size-fits-all for this. And yet, it's working with individuals that we begin moving larger things. And so when we have a platform to work with, and we can work with people who have a platform themselves that then become levers within organizations, then we can begin moving larger things than just a friend on Facebook. But most of us are just at the level where we have the friend on Facebook. And if we could get past immediately thinking, well, that's a silly, stupid idea, and panning them and move to the point of saying, well, here's a human being, and how can I engage a conversation with that human being? Because I have no idea what a conversation with that human being will lead to in their lives or who they will touch. And I probably took a rabbit trail on that, but help me out if I did.
No, I think that was good. And I want to go back to your previous comment where, a person wouldn't want to go into a museum about human origins. Why do you think there's so much misinformation around evolution, especially human evolution, in the Christian community? Why do so many Christians struggle to accept evolution?
Well, obviously that question is an entire semester course in college. There's a lot of historical reasons. We talked about false dichotomies. There was a created dichotomy in the late 1800s where a false and now debunked history was created just whole cloth about a war between science and religion, and people have run with that idea in different ways. A lot of the real anima has not been between science and religion so much as between the academic engagement of professionals with the original texts. We've learned a lot more about the original texts. We've learned a lot more about the history, a lot more about, there's just been enormous shifts in the way that professionals address the Bible that sometimes packed in extraneous philosophical or worldview pieces and develop things that were extremely challenging either to church positions or church leadership. I mean, when we think about the Galileo trial, for example, and this is a rabbit trail, but the Galileo trial was as much about Galileo's inappropriate or rather aggressive addressing of the Pope at the time as it was anything else. And so it's a very, very complex question. And the answer to that, I believe, is understanding the history behind it. And if we don't understand even a modicum of that history, then we are in a place where we're easily led into a dichotomous way of thinking.
So I had a really good conversation with some friends yesterday, and we were talking about education and just areas where we see education requiring improvement, and particularly integrating various topics together so they're not quite so piecemeal or disconnected, where there's more overlap and discussion of the nuances between the relationships. And I feel like you're kind of saying that education is a piece of the answer, understanding the history better, understanding, like if you understand what happened in Galileo's day, where it wasn't just merely a science-faith conflict, there was personalities involved and politics involved too. At the same time, I think there's a lot of people who just giving them facts and more details and more education. Like they already are rejecting. They already have an a priority commitment to a particular worldview or particular belief that if that information is in conflict, they just kind of throw it out the window. It doesn't update their understanding.
Right. And the question when someone, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, and I just wanted to tie that into sometimes like with different denominations, and you've talked about very different denominations that you've been part of, but sometimes denominations have very specific statements about particular things in the Bible, and sometimes they're pretty broad and encompass a lot more possibilities. To me, it seems like if you have something that's pretty specific, it makes it harder to shift or explore nuanced ideas in that area because you keep bumping up to denominational limits. So kind of talk about the influence of education and these limitations that maybe prevent people from even exploring the data.
Well, education has always been a central issue in society that creates a civic cohesion. It creates a way of being. And when we look at literature, those texts that have survived, things like Sappho from the ancient Greeks, survived because they were a school text. And a lot of the heat about teaching evolution, for example, in the United States relates to what can be taught in schools and the sense of that teaching undermining what is believed in the churches. And so education is a very important piece. I only found one other ministry project that was in the field at all, and it had to do with constellations and how they relate to an ancient story. But the field of science education was rife with voices of people who were grappling with these issues. How can I help students in my classroom responsibly grapple with these questions? And so education is a central piece. It becomes very politicized. It becomes something that not only politicians are working with, though, that the grassroots are working with. And if the grassroots are leading in a direction, we are not going to change the conversation from the top down. We're not going to legislate some other way of being because the grassroots are moving in a certain direction. And one of the reasons that efforts to teach creationism in schools have been defeated is because the grassroots of the scientific establishment have said, no, this is the scientific consensus. And really, when we start looking at creationism in its various guises, we're really talking about a religious conversation which doesn't belong in the scientific classroom. Now, wrong, right, up, down, that's the history of it and why it's created the heat it has. But it's also why legislative efforts to bring creationism have failed, because the grassroots of science is saying something different. The scientific community is saying something different. And yet, those outside the scientific community, those in very conservative churches, that grassroots is saying another thing, and it's pressing back against. And so will there be continued?
We've got a little.
And if they don't even know a scientist, if they don't know to be influences in a Christian time, if they don't know they can wrestle with these issues, and that it's a world that we can back and forth and learn things and grow in, then that's a conversation we're not having, and instead we're just fighting battles.
So I'm gonna pick at that scab a little bit that you just brought up regarding education. When we were growing up, I think we're all in about the same team picture about our age and education. When we were growing up, there might have been a Ben Franklin or a 7-Eleven on every corner, but there wasn't a mathnasium, right? There weren't these plethora of tutoring places that they're all over the landscape now, which might suggest, just by the prevalence of all these tutoring, especially in math places, it might suggest a weakness in the educational system in regards to where we are in mathematics. Framing conversations and other things like it, and for example, the Sparrow's Call, is kind of like that mathnasium. In other words, why are we necessary? Why is it necessary that we have to frame conversations with Christians? Why is it always, from the outside in, looking in, Dover was a Christian thing? It wasn't Jewish. It wasn't, Buddhist or Hindu. It was the Christian faith standing against modern science. And so my question to both of you, actually, but to you first, Walter, is why do you believe it's necessary that it seems that at least in the West, at least in the United States, evangelical Christians are the ones who are kicking against the goads when it comes to science and education?
Well, that is a loaded question in a lot of ways, and very complex. Obviously, it relates political and belief issues, but I think at its base, the question comes down to people who feel threatened, or they feel that the exploration of ideas in and of itself is a place that maybe it's a devil's playground, or maybe it's something that the common person doesn't engage in. And I believe a lot of that simply comes because people have these experiences. They are enculturated, and they don't really even know why they believe what they believe. I grew up Roman Catholic. I, was involved in the Mass every week. I was an altar boy. I could fall asleep when I was an altar boy. I would still stand up, sit down, say the right things. Now when I go to a Catholic church and I listen to the words and I understand what those prayers are meaning, and what is being said in that Mass, I have a profound experience of connection with God through that. It took a long process of other things for me to come to a rational and conscious knowledge of what had been what I had participated in. And so maybe that's a bad example, but people are walking around and they have a view of how we got here and what our purpose is, or lack of purpose is, and where we're going, these big questions. And those big questions are influenced by the wider world, by the things that come to us in media in every way. And many times someone has not sat down and reasoned out what they believe and why. Even about how we got here and why it is that they can trust whatever source of authority that they have. I mean, we see a crisis of authority right now in the United States. Who do we believe about news? What is trustworthy? Who can we kind of plant our flag? I said that earlier, and say this is right. And so I feel that the epistemological question and helping people grapple with the epistemological underpinnings of their life is a really valuable frame for looking at what then lies in that life and the way that it reacts. And so I, again, probably shifted off the question, but we're talking about, philosophies, we're talking about viewpoints that have been adopted by the rank and file many times completely unconsciously. I was also talking with somebody who is trying to help me understand why it is that the banks are going to collapse in the next couple weeks, and I need to stock up food and things like this, which a year ago somebody was trying to help me understand this and nothing happened, but they say this is still going to all come to pass. And so I'm in dialogue with this person, and they sent me a video. Now they may be watching, and I'm not getting onto them in any way, but the video was 1.5 minutes of images that were just very hard to look at, strung together with unsupported assertions, and it was disturbing, and it made you want to act and move. And if you already believed many of the things that that video was addressing, then it moved you more effectively in that position. But it wasn't a good argument, and it was something that was designed, again, to stir up those subconscious things. And so so many times we sit down to quote unquote talk to somebody about faith and science, and really all we're doing is defending our position against their position, and we're not talking to anybody. And they aren't either, because we're so incredibly threatened by their position. God is not threatened, I don't believe, by anyone's position. And many times we need his help to even begin to understand our own positions, how we got to them. And I had a professor one time who said that there's no good Sunday school class that you don't hear at least 3 heresies in. He was a systematics professor. And so, we need help ourselves. And unless we have a humility about us as we engage these big questions and a willingness to learn, then we're in we're in deep waters that we may be out of our depth in. And we may be assuming the role of guides when we need to be led. This may be off topic, and I know, Christine, you're going to respond as well. Could I say one of the things? We're at 209. So when you are a pastor in a charismatic or Pentecostal denomination, sometimes you get asked to do things that a Presbyterian pastor may not, or maybe they do, and I've just not been one. But I was in Washington, D.C., and I had a young man come into my office. And the young man said, I have demons. I'm from Mongolia. My grandfather was a shaman. I've opened my third eye. And he listed off every reason that he had demons and all of the different demons and how he could feel them and all of it. And he had let me know that this was what the visit was about. And I had other people, and we had been praying. And then he said that the worst event had happened right after he took an enormous hit of acid and got locked up after having some theft. And so I relate that, and I won't share what we ended up doing, to say that there's a reality there that is multifaceted. We have a young man who has done things spiritually that the Bible very clearly says don't do. Don't associate with demons, et cetera, et cetera. We also have a young man there who has done things that could have altered the biochemical pieces of his body. And so, is that a spiritual puzzle? Or is that a psychological puzzle? Or is that a physiological puzzle? Well, I would submit that all of those pieces are there. And how it gets teased apart and how it gets worked with, well, that's the pastoral dance, and that is the interpersonal dance that we do with another human being, and even how we parse that, in our cosmology. will be different. The cosmology of Mark is different than the cosmology of Luke, is different than the cosmology of John. They were emphasizing different aspects. And so I only pose that as food for thought about the complexity of even coming to definitions with some of these questions.
So I kind of want to bounce back to something that you said earlier around, and so a thing I have heard regularly, or from time to time, at least in sermons, is like, okay, well, we're going to just focus on the core of Christianity. And I don't care what you believe about politics, or I don't care what you believe about science. Jesus rose from the dead, and we're going to just kind of focus on that. And it seems like what's communicated is, we're just not going to talk about those things because they're controversial, and I'm not equipped to talk about them, and I don't want to stir trouble in my church. So let's just focus on something we can all agree on. And I think to some extent that's true, right? I mean, whether you vote red, white, blue, green, purple, stripes, whatever, that doesn't determine whether or not your heart has been committed to following Christ. And Christianity isn't about a particular belief around biology, right? That's not what salvation is. So there is a place to have these core beliefs, but I think it goes a step too far, or it leads people to go find answers somewhere else, or to do this dialogue someplace else that's not occurring in the church. Which is why, when John asks, why do we have these mathnasiums and these ministries like we have? Because it isn't happening in the church. For whatever reason, many churches aren't talking about bringing in someone to talk about vaccine safety, and who's an epidemiologist, or who's a physicist who can talk about particle sizes and how do masks work, or who can talk about areas of their field and have some kind of dialogue where there's people with experience and knowledge in these areas. It seems like there's instead this idea that any view on these peripheral thoughts is equally okay, and there aren't really any experts. It's kind of a return to this relativism, that there's not really truth.
Right.
So what's like something we can move forward to? Like, what are the consequences of this type of mentality in churches? And we can see that maybe even specifically in how many churches reacted to COVID. And how do we move past that at maybe like a holistic church level, as opposed to just like these individual conversations, which probably are the best way for mentoring, is in individual type conversations. But how do we set those up when the church just says, oh, we're going to focus on these core things, and kind of close our eyes to, we want you to love your neighbor, but we're not going to address the effects of not being vaccinated. We want you to seek truth, but we're not going to really talk about the evidence for one view compared with the evidence for another.
Well, a lot of thoughts about that question, Christine. A lot of thoughts. First off, I got to spend roughly 15 years researching this before I've had really wonderful times with seminary professors, scientists across the spectrum. And so most pastors aren't doing their doctoral work with the intent of doing a PhD in this area. And at 8 years in, even with what I was able to do, I still felt the task was somewhat overwhelming. There are so many voices, and the subject matter is complex, with a lot of competing material. Many people don't have any way of parsing that, and diving into it, there's not an easy introduction for a lot of people. When you think about a pastor, which is one of the really and truly general positions that are left in the world. I mean, you've got somebody who's everything from the CEO of an organization to its chief toilet cleaner, someone who could be drawing building plans or public speaking or representing to a city council, a church. You have a position there that is very difficult even to define. And on top of it, that individual, there are some denominations that you don't feel the pressure to establish an ethos in a church to the degree of others. And certainly growing churches today, many of them are independent churches, which I've served in independent churches as well. There you have the enviable position of creating everything from scratch. Thus saith the pastor, and it was so. And so you have a generalist position, and they need reliable voices to be able to go to, and yet they're also facing pressures from below in their congregation and above if they have a denominational structure that could very well influence the ability of them to put food on their table for their kids, keep the lights on. And so having a little bit of compassion for the people in charge of churches, dealing with every aspect of society, is a good starting point. And then to go back to the idea of relationships, again, if you are First Presbyterian, Washington, D.C., you probably have a couple scientists in your church. If you are, Muskogee First Assembly of God, or if you are, Middle of Arkansas Independent Pentecostal, you may not have met a scientist that you know beyond the local family doctor. And it's easy to not address things that particularly may be swimming upstream in those situations. And so, to further complicate that, we're really looking at a place where many of the denominations that are more intellectually rigorous did arise in the Enlightenment. Some of those that have arisen more recently take an almost anti-intellectual stance, and an ahistorical stance. So you're not even able to go back to the Enlightenment. You're reading the Bible and saying, I want to go all the way back to the first century and skip everything that happened in between. And yet we are a society that is post 20th century, and there's a lot of weird stuff that we learned in the 20th century. Mass and energy are the same things. First off, there are particles, and secondly, you can either observe where they are or what direction they're going, but you can't observe both, and et cetera, et cetera. The world got very strange in the 20th century, and many churches are either already reacting against the Enlightenment or trying to return to the Enlightenment, or they're abandoning the historical roots of the faith. They're no longer worried about creedal commitments, and they have embraced modernism to the point that they are no longer moored to the historical Christian faith, if I can say it that way. So there is again, an extremely complex thing here. And we really are talking about, how do we talk about individual churches? How do we talk about individual denominations? How do we then help those who are in those individual churches and denominations grapple with their own history, grapple with their own theological developments, and it really is just a mind-bogglingly complex task. And so, again, if we have someone who is a part of a tradition, let's say we have a local doctor who is a Lutheran, grew up in a Lutheran church, and an evangelical Lutheran church, and so they can then talk about their history in the church and the medical field and the local congregation. if there could be a combination, or rather, you know, that doctor is taking a pastor out to lunch. Let's talk about these things. Let's start unpacking it. Let's start understanding. And then they develop within the congregation the ability to talk to these matters in a Sunday school class format. Or maybe once a year, the pastor says, I'm going to have so-and-so, you know, give the message today. Or, you know, it really is relational because it is so complex. That's my thinking.
Yeah, it sounds like there's not really a simple three-step process forward here. It's going to be a lot of work and a lot of heart in addition to a lot of mind. We really appreciate your time and hearing your thoughts on this. Did you have any kind of final thought you'd like to share before we wrap up? We're kind of a little bit over time, but it's been such a good conversation.
Well, thank you. You know, I'm profoundly honored to be a part of the conversation. I've had a lot of things happen to me in my life that I can't explain other than there is a divine hand guiding this. And here's an example, and I'm saying this because I know that people listening may be on their fence about their faith. There was a time when I was a young minister. I was working in a church that put me on part-time, and then I'd be on full-time, part-time. And I was working about 5 or 6 jobs. I can't remember how many. I was doing 5 or 6 jobs. And it came to the point where I was driving off from the service station with the little gas thing still in the car and pulling, you know what I mean? I just couldn't do it all anymore. And I felt very strongly that God said, you need to drop some of this. And so I did. I dropped 2 or 3 of those jobs. And within a week, I had a call from a man that I didn't know, but he had married someone from a church that I had been a youth pastor in a couple years before. And this daughter had been in my youth group. And he started the conversation by saying, I've never done anything like this. But in my prayer time, I felt like God wanted me to give you money. Now, I mean, I was working 6, 7 jobs. I still wasn't making it. And I said, oh, well, that's wonderful. How much money? And he said, $1,000. And before I could say, wow, that's wonderful, he said, a month for 12 months. I have no explanation for that. The time, everything else, and I could go piece by piece through my life and simply say, I have seen too much not to believe. And all of these intellectual wranglings are powerful and interesting. But if there really is a living God, and I believe that there is, my request of him, even when I was an agnostic in college, I knew there was a God, or at least I believed there was, but I didn't know how to relate to him. I said, God, if you're real, show me. And I've seen it again and again. I could tell story after story like that. And so much of it is our perspective. I could have said, well, that was really interesting timing. That was really lucky. And I was right in saying that. But of course, I frame it differently because of the commitments that I have in my life. I had a professor once say to me, my missions professor, you know, the more prayers I pray, the more coincidences happen in my life. And whether we are just framing something or not, we are built to ask these incredible questions. It's drilled down into us to say, what is it that it means to be human? On my walk before our conversation, I looked at a bunch of cows in a field. The cows are not sitting around wondering, what does it mean to be bovine? But it's inherent to us to ask those questions. And one of the answers that has been lasting is, it is to be related to God. And the Christian answer is that God himself is not only transcendent, huge, immense, above the billions and billions and billions of galaxies and the billions of trillions of stars, but that he's immanent, that he cares for us. And there's a real puzzle to unpack with that. I mean, if we talk to the Vietnam vet, how do we unpack that puzzle? Not easy, and there's not easy answers. And if we walk in with easy answers, we're never going to build a relationship. But if we do build a relationship with people who have very difficult questions, maybe even our own selves, and are not scared of those questions, I believe that we can find answers. And a lot of times that only comes through people who've walked a little farther down the line than us. Thank you again for the time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Doctor. Folks, we appreciate you joining us. We are the Sparrow's Call. This is Voices in the Wilderness, where we try and introduce you to other resources, other ministries out there that help bridge the divide between faith and science, that help turn, as we say, doubt into wonder. So we're grateful for you having joined us, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.